In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers and magazine readers. Welcome to the Sublation Magazine Show, Sublation Media's weekly live stream in which we speak with authors from the magazine and try to discuss some of the issues of the day and their relevance to the left. I'm Douglas Lain, and this is
Ashley Frawley.
Frawley.
Co-host this week. It's every week.
Every week. Glad to have you back and to be co-hosting this new Sublation Magazine show. Before we start, though, I have to do all this business. I want to ask people to subscribe and hit the bell so that you get alerted whenever a new video on Sublation Media is uploaded or something goes live. Also, I want to make sure you keep up to date with Sublation Magazine's latest content. So you should follow us on Twitter and on Facebook and on, I think we're on Instagram. We're going to have a TikTok. Just follow us everywhere you can think of. And if you have the means, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Links to our Patreon are in the description. Right now, that is our major line of revenue, although later in the future, we will be selling you books. So keep your eye out for future titles such as, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, and Enjoyment Right and Left, and other titles. Also, if you want to, you can drop us a super chat today. So if you have some cash or change jingling around in your pockets and you want to drop us a super chat, we would be glad to get it. And I think Jean Bajalan is in the background. He will throw super chats up on the screen and make us interrupt ourselves and answer you if you drop enough cash. So, Ashley, what are we doing today?
Well, today we're going to talk about the election in France and the coalition of left-wing parties known as NUP and some of their success, depending on definitely a success, but some uncertainty depending on how you look at it. So we're going to talk about that issue today, what it means for the left, what it means for the right, what it means for the future of the world.
Right. And before we get to France, Jean inserted here that I needed to talk about what happened last week in New York City. We had a launch event in New York City at Project Parlor. It went very well. People who are our patrons are, waiting with bated breath to get access to the panel discussions we did there. We do have those recorded, at least as audio, but probably as video as well. Certainly at the KGB bar, we had a video camera on us, as well as everything being recorded by microphone. So the launch events will be made public soon. And I want to say thank you to everyone who turned up. It was a great event. Of course, I met Jason Miles there in person for the first time. I met Kuba there for the first time. I got reacquainted with Chris Catrone and Spencer Leonard, and Spencer Leonard, the editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine, and a whole bunch of other people. I think about 200 people showed up for our launch at the Project Parlor, so it was successful. And we will be releasing those panels to the public after we get a chance to censor them and erase people who've been sent to Gulag from the crowd. So let's talk about France. The former presidential candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, so I'm going to say that left populist coalition, NUPS, recently won enough seats in the National Assembly in order to break Macron's majority. They had hoped to gain a majority themselves and install Mélenchon as prime minister, but this wasn't achieved. Overall, it seems like perhaps a Pyrrhic victory. One of the members of the coalition, Fabien Roussel, said NUP didn't allow us to have a majority, and it didn't prevent the far right from making strong progress either. And that calls out to me, that questions me. I can see that the alliance only speaks to part of France, to that of the big cities, and not to that of rurality, the rural areas. Okay. So, depending, I pulled some information up from Wikipedia. Depending on the method of calculation, Noop won around 131 seats or 142, according to Le Monde, which was enough to deny Macron's his majority and enough to form a formal opposition within the parliament or in the assembly. The coalition performed worse than the polls predicted, and the National Rally, the RN, gained 89 seats, the best results ever. I was looking at this situation in France with a jaundiced view, probably too cynically from my American perch, projecting the Sanders results onto France. It's a very different situation there. Of course, the whole structure of government is different. But it did seem to me that their coalition had some of the same problems that we saw in United States and in the UK with momentum. I was reading Jacobin's coverage about Noop, and it appears that their victories in the last election were built upon voter apathy. Jacobin pointed to increases in voter participation in areas that were, they're kind of gentrifying areas. Montreal, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but according to the left liberal podcast, Be Your Change, Montreal is kind of the Brooklyn of Paris, and it's well known for its left politics. Another enclave of gentrification mentioned by Jacobin was the 20th borough or the 20th arrondissement. It's worth noting that in Paris overall, the class character has been changing. Working class has been leaving Paris for at least the last 5 years or more. And an essay in The Nation by Cole Stangler entitled "The Death of the Working Class Paris." He pointed out that demographics are changing in Paris and that it is becoming the land, the playground of the rich. It's worth asking, to what degree did the New Coalition's agenda reach out to? Conrad tells me it's Montreuil. That's how I should say that. And anyhow, it's worth pointing out that, it's worth asking, like, to what extent did their agenda connect with working class people in France? I mean, to go over the platform of La France Insoumise, which is the party of Mélenchon and probably the lead party within the new coalition. They have the desire to create a new republic, a sixth republic, and draft a new constitution to decentralize power and break what they call the presidential monarchy that is governing France in the Fifth Republic. They want to repeal a law, the El Khomri law, which allows French companies to lay off workers more easily. They want to reform France's treaties with the EU, exit from the EU. They want to create renewable energy in France and shut down France's nuclear power plants. They want to establish a green rule to limit production and consumption in France so that the natural world is not damaged as we produce and consume beyond what we can naturally support. They want to protect the commons, such as air and water and housing and healthcare and energy, which is, I think, a project of nationalization. They want to separate the retail and investment banks, raise minimum wage, and withdraw from trade agreements such as the TTIP. Overall, it's a particularly French list of positions, but it's also not. It seems within the same ballpark as what you might see from Momentum or from Labor or the
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it has some of the same kinds of issues, as you said, like tends to be populated by a kind of urban class, people who are centralized in urban areas with weak support in like peripheries and local, weak local ties as well, and are really perceived as being unable to address the concerns of the periphery, of the sort of non-urban elite. And of course, this is kind of reinforced by the fact that the left's politicians tend to be drawn from elite schools. So it's the same kind of issue that you see, that the left tends to be populated by a kind of urban middle class, kind of managerial class. But there's some change there. It's not. I mean, there have been more MPs that were drawn from working class backgrounds this time around, but obviously there's a lot that remains to be done in terms of connecting with French people outside of the cities. And of course, like the future of French politics will probably, and not just French politics, but generally will depend on connecting with people, with the working classes, with in France, workers in peripheral France, but a broader support base than a kind of, I keep saying like a managerial elite, but like sort of well-educated urban individuals.
Yeah, it's unclear to me just exactly what the class character is of the coalition, although it does appear from afar to be youth-led, but that's, who knows if that's true. Mélenchon certainly has a long track record on the left in France, but it's coming at a moment. Well, I watched an interview with an activist from Mélenchon's party that was run on This is Revolution, and they talked about the Yellow Vest movement and their attempt to kind of align with the Yellow Vest movement and represent that movement. But as he described it, this activist described it, the Yellow Vest movement was characterized as being apolitical, focused on economic conditions and basically on economic interests of the working class exclusively. And Conrad, by the way, will probably talk a bit about this when he comes on. He just messaged me again saying he's in Paris, so he knows a bit about what's going on. So we can start with that when he comes on for the interview. I wanted to run a clip from the This is Revolution podcast to sort of raise an issue that I think gets to the heart of what my concerns are. Whether or not it's the main concern that people should be having, I don't know. But here, I'm going to share this. Let's go here.
And the Yellow Vest movement was an occasion to get rid of any of the, how can I say it in the proper way, any debate that is non-related to basically the economic side of politics. We're not in debate during the Yellow Vest. And, you did not have the issue of all what we call progressive policies. We're not in question. The only questions were, will I get a higher wage? Will I get lower taxes? Will we have better public services? And so that allowed a lot of Le Pen voters to stand side by side with, for example, Mélenchon voters, because they were fighting for the same thing at that moment. And I think on the long term, that had a positive effect because it brought back a lot of Marine Le Pen voters, which realized that in the end, the most important thing is still, do I have enough money at the end of the month to survive? And it put the focus on this, and it brought a lot of voters back to the left, or at least to abstaining during elections.
All right. So my point there was that the reason I want to run that is because it seemed to me that depoliticizing the population was equated with bringing people to the left. The aim of maybe creating the low voter turnout that they saw in the National Assembly was part of their electoral strategy, or at least not an intentional aim. At least it wasn't considered to be a liability for the people who were part of the Yellow Vest movement to move, away from politics, mainstream politics, and somehow was thought to be a boon to the left when that happened. And I don't think that's true. I think the risk there is you're going to have what they just saw, which was an apathetic response to the election with a kind of mirage of a left-wing victory that will turn around just as soon as the enraged working class re-engages politically.
Well, I don't know, because at least from what I was reading, the abstention was more negatively affected Mélenchon more than it positively affected them. The big turnout was, or at least the people who abstained less were the people who voted ultimately for the far right. It was a lot of people who had said that they were in support of the leftist coalition that didn't turn up. That's why polls had said that they could win. I think it was something like 190 seats, and they performed considerably less successfully than that. And that was largely because of abstention. So it's, well, we'll come to this in a moment, but at least in the Jacobin interview with Aurélie Trouvé, my French is horrible. She had said that one of the key issues it will be trying to mobilize these voters who had abstained in the past and try to use that to take power, really.
Yeah, I think the reason I was thinking the way I was about abstention is because I was referring to the Jacobin article, which had come out after the first round, but before the second round. And it was in the second round that these abstentions really hurt the coalition. Is that right? Am I getting that correct? You know what?
I'm not sure.
You know who would know? Conrad Hamilton would probably know. Why don't we bring him in since he's in Paris? Our man in the street, Conrad Hamilton. Oh, there we are. Hey, Conrad.
You'll be shattered to discover that I don't know the details of how the abstentions, affected Noops and in which round. I may be able to provide a little bit of illumination on this situation, though, without being sort of a pundit level expert on French politics. I would just focus a little bit on the question of class composition, which Ashley was discussing, both in order to analogize as well as to differentiate the French situation from what we might see in the English-speaking world. Right. So if you look at a group it's a little bit more diverse with Noops, but if you look at Insoumise, right, really they have three pillars of support, right? And the first pillar of support is really students, right? Of which there's many in France, particularly in the urban areas, right, voting for them, right? The second is certain traditional working class voters, many of them perhaps older, who may have even supported the PCF, the French Communist Party, before. And the third is, roughly speaking, Muslims in France, right? Because, Mélenchon has been the most sort of emphatic in his condemnations of Islamophobia, for example. But I do want to stress this, and it's important for the Gilets jaunes too, that, France would be different than the English-speaking countries because you had the French Communist Party, which was very, very powerful. I think its peak it won like 28% of support, huge, very radical unions like the CGT. So you didn't, when someone like Thomas Piketty talks about the sort of embourgeoisement of the left, the Brahmanization of the left, when he talks about that in France, he talks about the PS, which is the Socialist Party, right? So the fact is that there was this sort of working class nucleus that was built up and that supported the Communist Party for many years. And when Insoumise began to rise in popularity, Contra, for example, the PS, a lot of those working class voters, particularly in urban areas, gravitated back into that fold, right? So I just mean to say that you haven't had the same level of embourgeoisment, because someone like Sanders is operating within the framework of the Democratic Party, right? There's a lot of working class people who just won't vote for the Democrats. As surely as there's a lot of working class people now in England even who won't vote for Labour, right? We saw sort of the collapse of the Red Wall. I think, and actually about the demographic change, even with there was an actual interesting thing when they looked at the presidential results. In France, the places in Paris which voted for Mélenchon were the same places that were on the barricades in the Paris Commune. It was like literally the same neighborhoods, which have been unchanged. So that gets us into a whole conversation about the gentrification of the French city. But I just meant to say, I think to make the overall point that there is still, even if it's weaker in rural areas, there still is more of a proletarian nucleus here. And that's actually what allowed something like the Gilets jaunes to be, to some extent, co-opted by the left. I mean, I don't purport to say that was totally successful, but...
So do you think that what do you think the future of the right is in France, and Le Pen's party is? Because they did gain more seats than they'd ever gained before, and they seem to me like the slow and steady progress for Le Pen. It seems to be occurring alongside the kind of sporadic upticks of left support. Do you think that Le Pen is going to be? I actually told someone in a moment of deep cynicism that Le Pen was an inevitability in France, but am I way off base here? What's the threat from the right there?
Well, there's been a clear uptick, in Le Pen's support for several years, right? And so even with even with the most recent presidential election, I think that she ended up gaining about 7% of support, right? So it's not, even though Macron was able to win that, progressively, in the runoff votes, people have been winning by smaller margins against the far right. So what you can deduce from that is that the far right in France has been more successful than the left in exploiting, the frustrations with the status quo. Right, which have emerged due to various economic difficulties, more recently COVID. I think that to some extent, within, in particular, third, fourth, fifth week of the Gilets jaunes, the way that you had like the Communist Party coming up for the Gilets jaunes, the gauchisation of the partial gauchisation of the Gilets jaunes bodes well for the possibility of the left breaking outside of some of its more traditional enclaves. But I think that still remains very much at the level of a kind of, at most, latent possibility. And I think that one can see a clear pattern, particularly with the extreme unpopularity of Macron and the sort of reforms which he's passing. I mean, France never went fully neoliberal in the vein of, the United Kingdom or Canada or the States. That's actually a train that's contested right now. Right, Macron's trying to do what a lot of these countries did decades ago, and he's very unpopular in France. So he's done so much to discredit, so to speak, right, this political status quo, and the far right have been simply more efficient than the left in picking up the pieces. I don't know. I think it's good that the left is working together more, though it should have happened long before it ultimately did end up happening, like before the presidential election. Right, something like MOVE should have been created. I think it's good that the left is working together, but I couldn't, I think it would be very imprudent to sit here and say, well, the left's got the recipe and it's going to work.
Right. Well, let's move on and talk about your piece in Sublation Magazine. I wish I had some sort of transitional video to run, to get us there. I'll just here. I'll do. All right, so there. Oh, what the heck is that? All right, so all right,
Very
so.
smooth.
But I thought you were going to do something like a fetal scan or something, but no, just the head of the article. It's okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's it, isn't it? That's the that's your piece. Abortion,
yeah.
Capitalism, and Demographic Control, and it's been a point of controversy within the magazine. You at least it got a response, but. You wrote this piece, and I guess it explores the material basis for abortion rights and the way in which the needs of the economic base of society have dictated changes in abortion law. Going all the way back to pre-capitalist medieval period, and the Black Death and all of that.
Early capitalist, we would say, because in the late Middle Ages, you have the first sort of stirrings, right, of a sort of capitalist structure. I sort of confine it to an analysis of the capitalist mode of production.
Okay, I think there are people who are Marxists who would debate when capitalism began.
Of course, yeah.
But let's just say before Coca-Cola, let's call it the pre-Coke era.
Prehistory. Yeah.
Yeah. Before McDonald's. So you wrote that abortion was tolerated up until the beginnings of modernity, say, instead of capitalism. What factors led to the first bans on abortion?
Well, I mean, I'm very, very hesitant to make completely sweeping statements about, the character of abortion under pre-capitalism. Though, a lot of that, my particular commentary on that period is influenced by Federici, Caliban and the Witch, right? And she sort of discusses the distinction between a kind of pre-capitalist environment, which people have to do penance, for example, if they sort of performed abortions, versus a kind of early capitalist environment, in which essentially, the popular struggles ignited by the empowering of both peasants and sort of urban workers because of the Black Death, because there were so few actual people, right? Demand for, it altered the entire character of labor power, if you will. Its value, right, and its supply. That there was an attempt to ensure that the birth rate, would be adequate to meet the needs of the economic society in that context, right? And because of this, you began to get really, really harsh penalties being imposed, right? Of course, this is very much the era of the witch hunts and things like this. Women's heads being cut off and nailed on for public display and this kind of thing, right? In order to show you really shouldn't be doing this, right?
Right. And so, do you think that? Well, my next question I've written down here is, how is the struggle for socialism, the right to abortion, interconnected? But I guess what I should ask as an interim step towards that question is, under in the Coca-Cola age, how has abortion rights, how have they arisen? How have they been connected to the needs of the needs of capital?
Yeah.
And how do you see them, like the fact that we gained abortion rights in the 70s, connecting to the economic conditions?
Yeah, well, I just, to just give a little bit of a survey of the overall trajectory of the article. I mean, I proceed from discussing the relationship between, the Black Death and sort of the supply or value of labor power and these sort of extreme repressive measures which are created. Then I sort of progress to the industrial era, right? And again, these are just snapshots of history. It's kind of an archetypal, it's a very short article, an archetypal idea of like Western history, right? But I progress to the industrial era, particularly in England and France, and I argue that the possibility for the creation of relative surplus power and the introduction of women en masse to the labor force means that there isn't the same pressure to simply have a large number of workers being reproduced as before. So in this context, abortion remains illegal, but there's a sort of de facto availability of it, which circulates. And I think you can link this to the sort of, opinions evinced by someone like Thomas Malthus, who's terrified of the poor reproducing, right? He actually wants to restrict that, right? And that very much has to do with the economic contours of that society.
But if I could just ask though,
yeah.
Malthus's writing about like the horrors of the working classes reproducing coincides with the time when that long period of toleration for abortion before quickening starts to shift away from that. Oh, right. Yeah, that's the argument you're making, basically, isn't it?
That's that. Well, I mean, you have what I actually say is that you have very harsh penalties within what we might construe as early capitalism, which Marx characterizes as being based on absolute surplus value, the unlimited extension of the working day, right? So in this context, you really just want to have more workers, to simplify. But then when you get the introduction of industry, right, and the ability to create relative surplus value, women coming into the workforce, right, then there's not the same pressure. Right, in that way.
Right. No, I messed that up. I'm so sorry. What I meant to say was it's the opposite. So like Malthus is saying that you shouldn't be reproducing, that sort of thing. But this coincides with the time in which actually tolerance is lower. So isn't that a counterpoint to what you're arguing?
No, what I'm saying is that there actually was a sort of weird, there was a de facto relative accessibility of abortion in the time when Malthus was actually writing, in comparison with the extreme repressions we see in the earlier era, right? So it's actually extremely common, right? In the industrial, you had all kinds of abortion providers, all kinds of, weird sort of self-produced recipes, right, that were used, in England and France, in order to deal with that. And actually, even Malthus himself, when he writes about this, right, he talks about, he was, of course, like a churchman, right? He was a minister, right? So he talks about this and he says, basically, I think, recourse to this, abortion, for example, could be useful in realizing the aims that I lay out, but my status as a churchman makes it impossible for me to condone that, right? So, it's sort of a weird qualified endorsement of abortion in that way, even. But then I sort of follow things into the 20th century, and of course the Soviet Union is the first state, right, that uniformly legalizes abortion. Then it re-legalizes it in 1936 due to concerns about a falling birth rate. But I think in this time, and I think the Soviet Union, and it's clearly galvanized by some of the changes which were characteristic of industrial society in general. But it's really the Soviet Union, at the vanguard of pressing for the inclusion of women in the workforce, even in the military, as we would see later on. I think it's really the USSR that ends up driving that, and that's in very stark contradiction to the views of a lot of fascist regimes, for example. Right, so the Nazis were very, very clear, right, about their desires to, sequester women back in the home, right? That was a very explicit part of their program, So, but of course, the states reacts too, right? So in the 1920s, you have the organization of the Women's Bureau. With the World Wars, men going away, right, means that you have to have, more female workers, and eventually this becomes more normalized. Now, at the end of the piece, I turn a little bit and I discuss the different strategies used by, the United States and the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War to ensure the reproduction of labor power. And I point out that, in the Soviet Union, essentially, they decided eventually that making abortion illegal wasn't going to solve their birth rate problem, because the number of abortions being performed actually went up even after they legalized it. So right after Stalin's death, I think in 53 or 55, they re-legalized abortion. And in the Soviet Union, had these waves of like pro-natality policy, right? In terms of the provision of like, family allowances and childcare and these kinds of things. And this has sort of equivocal results, right? I think it does help encourage a slightly higher birth rate, but the Soviet Union does go through a wave of a number of demographic crises. Now, in the States, by contrast, the liberalization and the elimination of immigration quotas, particularly restricting Asian and African immigrants in 1965, essentially, even if that wasn't the explicit intention of that, gives way to a sort of political environment in which, immigration is more and more used, right, to ensure the replenishment of the working age population. So part of my interest in the essay is also discussing what I consider to be the very complex ethics of that, because I think that, I'm certainly not against immigration, but I think that, it is quite problematic, if, exploitative immigration policies in terms of brain drain and everything are being, implemented in the context of a society where working people don't even have money to have like families, right? Mm-hmm. So I propose trying to, create an environment where reproductive freedom is available, as well as an environment, in which we're trying to be perhaps more discriminating and more ethical in terms of how we, use immigration, right? So that's sort of the conclusion.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, if you could be explicit about how you think that today's changing material conditions are setting up a situation where the overturning of Roe has some sort of rational basis for the American society. Do you think that it would be beneficial for the capitalist class in America for there to be lots and lots of new babies being born in the United States because of the, and I'm going to say rural babies, babies in red states. Is that going to be helpful for the productive capacity of America in some sort of long-term vision that might be in the background unconsciously being formulated by capital?
Yeah, I mean, there's more work to be done here in terms of linking up the particular demographic policies which Trump is pursuing with his sort of economic approach, which I would argue is probably rooted in the antagonism between domestic and transnational branches of capital. But I will say this. I will say that, one thing that we see, Ethan Lain, of course, responded to my piece.
Yeah, I want to get to that.
Yeah. And one thing, he suggested was, he said, well, Bongard is suggesting, or Hamilton, as the case may be, is suggesting that, there exists a link, between the reduction of immigration under the Trump administration, because actually, partly because of sort of his rhetoric and partly because of tangible policies like the lowering of the refugee cap and the lowering in the issuance of green cards and this kind of thing, immigration fell like enormously under Trump. Right. And that is just, in spite of, even like someone like George W. Bush sort of kicking off the reign of terror of ICE, that is not something that happened. Immigration was steadily rising, even under earlier Republican presidents. Right. So Reagan, right, we have like amnesty for immigrants. Right. George W. Bush actually proposed a bill, right, to encourage the naturalization of undocumented workers that was defeated by members of his own party in 2007. right? So Trump was the first one to really, pursue the immigration issue in a dogged way. And I mean, you can see the result. I think immigration falls from about 680,000 a year to 390 by the end of his presidency. So I basically said, like, look, I think that if you look at what's going on with Roe v. Wade, that I think that it is connected, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when someone might say, well, is actually making abortion illegal, or in the states where that's going to happen, is that going to result actually, in the lessening of the performance of abortions? To which I think one can respond, well, look at the sort of cyber surveillance techniques which are available today. I mean, there's no precedent for that in history if we talk about delegalization in the USSR in 1936. But in Leinen's piece, he came and he criticized this. He said, well, he sort of has this weird mystificatory idea of judicial independence. It's very strange.
Yeah. Let me ask my question about that to set this up.
Yeah.
So, what did you think of Ethan Leinen's argument in his essay "Wrong Life and Abortion" that the decision to overturn Roe was not about increasing the birth rate, but was cooked up by the Democrat Party for political reasons?
His piece, the one thing about Leinen's arguments is sometimes they're very hard to follow. So I'm not sure if he was saying exactly that it was cooked up by the Democratic Party for political reasons, or whether he was sort of saying, like, that will be the practical result, is that it'll be used by the Democratic Party to blackmail their voters. He's not always clear. And that's a major problem.
I think I saw him say something pretty close to that the Democrats let it happen on purpose kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that, I think that with that, I think he says something like, he sort of, again, I don't go too far along this line about what you're saying, but one thing that he does say is he says that the Supreme Court, operates outside the dog and pony show of two-party politics. So he basically suggests that there was a broad sort of complicity, between the Republicans and Democrats to maintain the status quo, in which abortion was legal but precarious, let's say in the United States, right? Both sides are able to sort of galvanize their bases, right, without actually changing the fundamental status quo. And then he suggests that, inexplicably, like a bolt from the blue, the Supreme Court came in, changed it. He provides no explanation for that. I mean, this is a very, very bad understanding of the situation, right? Not to put too fine a point on it, because, if you actually look, and this is what you have to do, right, if you're serious about going into this issue, and this is what I do in my response, which I hope will be out in a day or two. If you look at the appointment of judges since abortion became a polarizing issue, right? It's even you look at I think between 1980 and 2005, half the judges that were appointed by Republican presidents weren't even anti-Roe, right? The first judge that was appointed by Reagan was Sandra Day O'Connor, right? Now, what did Sandra Day O'Connor do? Well, in Arizona, she actually made abortion legal. That was her record. And as soon as Reagan made that appointment, people like Jerry Falwell were, effusive, right? How could he do this to us? He's betraying us, right? So I think that what was well understood in those years from 1980 to 2005, right? I think what was clear is that the Republicans didn't really want to overturn Roe, right? They basically were like appointing, they were appeasing their base by appointing, I think 4 of 8 of the judges they appointed in that period were anti-Roe. And they knew that in conjunction with the Democratic judges in the Supreme Court that it wouldn't be overturned. You can never be exactly sure, but that'd be a general thing. Now with Trump, that changes, right? And this is, that really does change, because, they looked at, you have the situation you had, because now, Trump actually created the first pro-life majority, right, in the Supreme Court in history. Well, how did he do that, right? You had 3 pro-life judges in the Supreme Court, right? You had Thomas, Alito, and Scalia, right? So Scalia went out, right? He was replaced by Gorsuch, right? So there you had 3, right? Then Trump, right, after having appointed Gorsuch, a pro-life replacement for Scalia, who's also pro-life, he went ahead and appointed...
I think it's Scalia, but it doesn't matter. Keep going.
Yeah, okay. It's like a Montreuil, right? I get France, you get the States. There you go.
Yeah.
But, then... so Scalia was replaced with Gorsuch, so there was 3, and then Trump went ahead and appointed 2 more pro-life judges, which were Kavanaugh and Barrett, right? So he totally knowingly, right, created a pro-life majority, and then just 20 months later, right? You know, Roe, they do exactly what you might expect them to do, right? They overturn Roe, right? But this is, but again, in terms of Leinen's argument, I mean, even you know, what's striking, even if we look at these parallels, and we know someone like Steve Bannon was very influenced by populist movements in Europe. You know, looking at the relationship between immigration, you know, and abortion policies, you know, you have the exact same or very similar strategy pursued in Poland, law and justice, right? You know, in other words, like they were a right populist party, right? You know, more so than the Republicans, they implemented pro-natality measures, though Ivanka Trump did try to do that. You know, but they were combining a very, very strong anti-refugee line, right? You know, with an anti-abortion line in a sort of conspicuous attempt to alter the demographics of the country, right? And just the same month, actually, Coney Barrett was confirmed, which was October 2020. The Polish High Court, which had been stacked with law and justice representatives, made abortion illegal there. Right, you know, and the Trump, even members of the Trump, you know, government, right, administration, attending events hosted by the Hungarian embassy with Viktor Orban championing, you know, procreation, not immigration policies, like the literal name, right? Like, so I just don't think if you actually go through this that the link is very obscure, and it seems weirdly un-Marxist to me to just like, you know, hang your hat on this idea of judicial independence. I mean, Marx is pretty clear about, you know, the law. This is part of the superstructure. Right, you know, maybe in some cases it can have a determinate effect, but for the most part, you have to try to trace these things back to the sort of economic determinacy.
Can I ask a question about that?
Go ahead, Ashley. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, about the tracing back. Is this? I suppose you've just sort of done that to a certain extent, but I mean, in the actual rhetoric of the different movements that have been pro-choice versus pro-life, do you see this kind of these links back? If you sort of dig through to trying to increase the birth rate or something like that, because if you look just in the United States, for example, there's, you know, corporations, for example, were very much pro-choice. So if this is all, I just wonder if there's a kind of vulgar materialism at work here, where you kind of, oh, something is happening in the superstructure and you go straight to something in the base, as opposed to understanding the superstructural makeup of the issue, and then through a deep understanding of that, tracing back to what might be going on in the base. Are you kind of starting by saying, well, abortion is always about population and that sort of thing, and so that must be the case now?
Well, there are a number of contingencies, right? You know, even in terms of, you know, procedural aspects of like the Supreme Court. So I'm not trying to say that you can say there's a direct causal line, right? You know, this is sort of what Althusser tells us, right? We're never going to find an example of a society where you really can identify like a pure economic determination, but that doesn't alter the value of it as a sort of heuristic, right? In the same way that you won't point out that.
No, I'm not saying that. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, anytime
I was actually getting
mentioned on the show, like there should be a buzzer that sounded, or like a trap door opens up and you fall through.
Like Dr. Evil, right? Dropping the people in the flames. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. That's Althusser, boom. Okay,
I do have a response, but I do have a response to Ashley's question, and I want to just again. So, you know, I think that, you know, the issue here, and I wrote another piece which deals more heavily with this particular aspect of the question, which is called "Why Can't the Right Be Cancelled?" For Aereo magazine. But in that piece, one thing I argue, and I was struck by some of the points made by Alfred Sohn-Rethel in his book, The Economy and Class Structure of German Fascism. And what he argues in it essentially is that if you were to look at something like the Nazi movement, you'd really have to look at the depression of domestic industrial producers, right? And the way that the Nazis sided with those kind of branches of industry, as opposed to, for example, the banks like Siemens, who were like totally, you know, frustrated and angry about the sort of changes that were occurring under fascism because they were losing access to international markets, right? So I think if you look at the United States, I mean, I think you can see that, you know, there's been certain firms which have been very, very, you know, are totally dependent on this sort of completely transnational capitalist structure. We could take something like Facebook. Like, is Facebook closer or further from getting into the Chinese market after Trump's sort of, you know, jousting with China over the past few years? You know, but I think that there are a lot of firms, you know, in the United States which have suffered. And so I
would just point out that Biden's administration has made things much more difficult for Facebook's, you know, allegiance or, you know, breaking into the Chinese market than even Trump did. due to the situation in Ukraine. I do want to enter a question in here, which is
wait, can I just finish that point before we move on? The reason why I asked that is because I wasn't saying that economic determination doesn't matter. I'm saying that if you look at the superstructure and you understand the superstructure and what's going on with different groups warring it out, you may find that the economic determination is not what you initially assumed. That's why I was bringing up that point, because I just think it's interesting. And actually, a viewer pointed this out to me last week in an email, that I had used the example of teetotaling of the temperance movement, the American temperance movement, and Joseph Gusfield's examination of that. And he was saying that the reason why these people wanted to prohibit drinking in other people, because they themselves didn't drink and didn't see people who ever drank, they wanted to prohibit in other people, which is very similar to the abortion issue, right? They're not going to get abortions for themselves, is because they were, well, they might do actually, but because they were previously the economic power in society. These religious groups, they had actually held the economic power, but that was on the wane. And so as they were losing this economic grip, they entered into all these moral crusades because it was an expression of their loss of power. And so I just, and what this viewer pointed out to me was that it was in the, up until the 1800s, that even within the Catholic faith, even among popes, life was considered to begin at quickening. And the idea of life begins at conception was like this hardline, rare position. And it only changed, interestingly, in the 1800s, which is right around the time of these kinds of temperance movements as well. And so there might be something else entirely going on. That's why I was asking, well, like, what exactly were these groups warring it out over? Who were the major factions? Because you can't start at the economic base, because you might just pick out the wrong thing.
Let me just say too quickly. I just want to say that.
Let me just throw in one other thing on top of that. So the other thing is, like, when you talk about Trump's agenda to overturn Roe, you're talking about a political candidate who's completely opportunistic and who turned to the religious right as a major, force behind his election, without any real ideological commitment to them, except as a voting bloc that he could manipulate. And since Roe has been overturned, he's expressed dissatisfaction with that outcome. So the question becomes, like, what created the situation where that coalition of voting blocs that Trump used could come together to get him elected? And how was the background economic situation and the ideological situation set up that contest between two different coalitions, say the Clinton one and the Trump one, and producing an outcome which I don't think either party necessarily wanted. But when we realized that it was not an outcome that the Republicans necessarily really wanted, but was sort of a kind of a fluke of this coalition building, then we can ask ourselves the question: were the Democrats opportunistic in their response to it? Did they have a political motivation to allow it to go on as far as they did? And do we think, and this is a question that has sort of been skirted, that it would have been a better approach to securing the rights of women for reproductive freedom if it hadn't hinged on a Supreme Court decision, which, someone like Norman Finkelstein would point out was maybe sketchy at best, and not constitutionally supported. So there, I've added my blather to the mix.
Sure. So let me just say schematically. So to Ashley, I would say that I think that your sort of thesis of kind of retreating, let's say, and this is a little psychoanalytic, right? Kind of retreating neurotically, right? Into these sort of moralistic issues. I think that would be more usefully applied to characterize the position of the Republican Party in the era where they weren't, for example, actually trying to alter the composition of the Supreme Court in a way that would lead to the overturning of Roe. And it's very interesting if you look at the shift in conservative rhetoric, right? Because if you look at, when Trump was being supported, the refrain that was being repeated and being used to criticize his opponents was like, oh, they're cuck-servatives, right? It's like they pay lip service to conservative causes, but they're not actually prepared, right? To transform the structure of American society, right? So as to accord with that. So I think actually looking at the era prior to Trump, I think what it kind of shows you is, one, what you're saying, right? The tendency to sort of neurotically fixate upon these issues, perhaps as a means of recompense somehow for the total takeover by neoliberal capitalism. which is, often quite a moralistic. But two, I think the way that even using that sort of escape can actually provide a sort of edifice upon which a more transformative and reactionary program can emerge. So I think that's interesting. In response to Doug, so you're asking me about the causal relationship between these things. Doug, can you pitch that back to me really quick so I can
Yeah, I'll say it again. Well, first of all, the idea here is that that when you have a cynical actor like Trump, an opportunist like Trump, it's unclear what outcome is intended and what outcome is accidental. He did say after the Roe was overturned that he was not happy about that outcome, and also when you have these things happen in a way that seem contingent or accidental, and not the direct expression of any political party's will, or political actors' will, particularly, except for some small faction of the electorate and the base of the Republican Party, which is this Christian right, which has been wanting to overturn Roe for a long time. But when their success hinged upon the precarious election of Trump and the cobbling together of a coalition that could get him just barely over the finish line. So, his they were paid off. They were recompensed by his selection in the Supreme Court. And this is the outcome. But meanwhile, there are these other political actors, the Democrats, who for the last 50 years, roughly, have allowed abortion rights to be predicated on a Supreme Court decision alone, rather than some sort of change in the Constitution or federal legislation.
Not that they didn't try.
Right. But they didn't organize effectively politically to get that accomplished. And certainly there's a feeling as though among some that after the leak of the decision to overturn Roe, the Democrats were gleeful and using it as an opportunity to fundraise more than organize. So I just wonder how we should think about all of that, how we should think about Ethan Lang's argument and his piece.
Sure. So I just want to say about Trump, I mean, opportunistic as he may be, I think the thing is Trump would have just been a sideshow, really, if his program hadn't managed to, connect with, genuine cultural energies that were at work, right? And I think archetypally we would sort of say that, the person who was maybe perhaps most responsible for engineering this was Steve Bannon, right? In terms of looking at these sort of developments that are afoot in Europe and recognizing the possibility of importing those to the United States, right? But again, I don't think that, I don't know, you're talking about Trump expressing disapproval about I thought I just read that he said it was the biggest win for life or something. And I don't know, maybe he's evinced
maybe I should listen to should verify before I say things, because this is something someone told me. It's not something I actually read. So
but I just mean to say about that, I think that I think that what you can see with Trump is that there is a clear model, right, that's provided and that's emanating of Europe. I mean, we could talk about the steady gains by someone like Marine Le Pen, who's extremely anti-immigration and extremely pro-natalist. We could talk about UKIP winning the first general election. I think that the Labour Tories didn't win since 1906 in 2014, right, in the European elections in Britain. We could talk about law and justice. We could talk about Orban, right? So all of that was very, very clear, right? And all of that was available to them, right? And I think that, all that Trump, for all of his sort of bluster and for all of his opportunism, I think he found a sort of column of the society that he was able to align himself with, right? And again, I think that trying to answer that question fully and satisfactorily, would lead us into, a sort of in-depth analysis of, different branches of American capital. And I don't purport to have done a study of that which is sufficiently deep. But I would just stress that I don't think that there's anything about this which is contingent. I think that this result was, plotted by the Republican Party, right? I think that Trump pursued that deliberately.
Well, there's another angle to this. I think there's a reason why Ethan is making the arguments he does, and it has to do with a different orientation around what socialists should be pursuing when it comes to the abortion debate, trying to break out of the what he considers to be capitalist politics and towards a socialist politics, and that means not only conceiving of reproductive freedom in terms of the right to abortion, but to a right for a different context for childbirth and child rearing overall, the socialist struggle for actual emancipation of women.
That's like a very weird argument, because, you know, he looks at what I write, right? And in my article, I advocate, you know, providing more support for families and attempting to organize a more ethical immigration policy. And he writes, I quote, "One must assume that Hamilton is only talking about the capitalist state." And then a little while later, he says, well, we should have like a mass socialist party. Well, it's very strange to me, this sort of argument, because, you know, even if the sort of mass socialist party that Lain envisions, right, were to win in the US elections, right, you know, pending more radical and perhaps more global changes, they would still be faced by much the same conundrums that we're trying to deal with today, right? So in that case, I don't see how they would hope to do better, you know, than the sort of policies which I lay out. I mean, if we want to talk about science fiction, we can, right? But I mean, those realities will be relevant to any socialist party taking power, even in the present. And then he proceeds to a very, very quite dogmatic, you know, sort of approach to where he says, well, you know, socialists should do things themselves, right? You know, they shouldn't advocate through the capitalist state. And he said, socialists of the past knew this, but socialists of today don't, right? But this is really, really strange too. Like I find it really curious, like who these socialists of the past are. It's like there were all kinds of socialist, you know, parties which, you know, voted in legislatures to legalize abortion within capitalist states, whether it's, you know, Italy, France, Nepal. But moreover, as regards the more general question concerning support for reforms, I mean, I'm, you know, if it makes strategic sense for socialists to try to seize state power or for socialists to organize the provision of services directly, I support it. But, you know, it does occur to me, like, who are these socialists of the past? I mean, Marx effusively praised like the 10-hour bill, right? In England, there were all kinds of insane reactionaries, even who voted like some of them even voted for that bill. You know, and Marx was like, this is a great victory for the working class. He offered direct support to Lincoln, right? Who's a bourgeois politician, because he felt that he was, you know, transforming in America in a way that would be germane to the socialist struggle. You know, Lenin lectured Luxembourg. He harshly chided her, right, for dismissing the utility of parliamentary representation that could be used as a launchpad for radical legislation. So again, I find the argument very, very confused.
Well, you're picking up on aspects of the argument that I didn't ask you about, though, because what I was asking about was particularly the need to frame the debate around abortion in terms beyond just the right to abortion, but that would include improving the conditions of women overall, so that they had the reproductive rights in both direction, so that having a child wouldn't be such a
well. That's my argument, Doug. That's my argument in my original article. You're not quoting Lein. I make that argument. I say freedom from both sides.
Right. So we agree. When he defends, so you agree with him.
Well, I don't agree to the extent that, you know, I don't disagree with him when he says, like, you know, we could have a you know, a mass socialist party. I mean, I think the real problem is that, you know, his critiques of me mostly rest on misreadings and mischaracterizations of the original article, right? So that would be tantamount to a sort of criticism.
To put it more charitably, would you say that the real underlying disagreement between the two of you is around the strategy for creating the conditions for socialism? You know, what to what extent reform, what kinds of reforms are radical, and what kinds of reforms are just keeping us within the capitalist frame, and to the degree to which do-it-yourself approaches are necessary for socialist struggle and so on. I mean, I think you guys should pick that up.
I don't reject, like, I don't actually categorically reject any of the tactics that he supports, right? Roughly speaking, either the self-organization of these services by socialists themselves or the direct annexation of state power. You know, what I do think is that, you know, his characterization of the actions of past socialists is historically incorrect. And I also think that, you know, he precludes, you know, certain forms of, you know, strategic action which could be useful. right? And that certainly people like Marx or Lenin recognized the utility of. So it's not that I'm saying that, he's wrong. I'm saying that I don't think that we should turn strategy into identity, right? And kind of say, well, like we'll create socialist revolution by, reading out of the Revolutionary Cookbook or something. Well, this works, this doesn't, right?
Be better than the Anarchist Cookbook, but yeah, I understand. I have a book right here that's Theories of Revolution. I'm just going to read this book and then we'll be ready to go. Listen, Conrad, it was great having you on. You should come back again. Write another article for us, of course. Respond to Ethan and keep responding. I'm gonna let you go for now, but it was fun. We're at the hour mark, and Jean is going to fire me if I don't start to wrap it up at this moment. So
precarious employment in the neoliberal age.
That's right. All right. So, Ashley, we're here at the end of yet another Sublation Magazine show. I want to tell people that they should join us in the Parrot Room. But what did you think? How'd that go? You comfortable? How'd it go? I felt like it went all over the place, but it was good.
Yeah. I mean, we'll in the second hour we'll go into a little bit more detail about some articles around the French elections and a little bit more into depth about some of that subject area. But I did manage to ask the questions that I wanted to have an answer for. I was also distracted by the chat in which some weird war was being waged, and at one point I was called Swansea Barbie. But that's
what? Oh my God!
I will take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Wow. So when someone said in the chat, what I saw was that we should talk about Zizek's article in The Guardian. Maybe we can do that next week as our. I mean, we're a little bit out of date when we do that kind of thing because it was a while ago that he wrote it. But he says, speaking of The Guardian, Zizek's last article was atrocious. I haven't seen many people discussing it. Perhaps next week we can discuss that article at the top of the show. And the other thing I'll say is that in the Parrot Room, we will not only be discussing the French election, but also, more importantly, the passing around of an article or essay about how white supremacy can pervade through the psychology of even people of color if they do things like try to be perfect or overemphasize rationality or, lean on math or I don't know. A very dumb article that's being brought up in school boards and nonprofit organizations to try to stamp out white supremacy in our thought, which seems to me to be racist.
Yeah, this week in accidental racism.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I'm going to say come join the patron version of this. It will be starting about 10-15 minutes. We're going to have Jean Bajlan and Editor-in-Chief Spencer Leonard there, as well as Ashley and myself. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, go to sublationmagazine.com. That's sublationmag.com. Read everything there. And yeah, keep those trollish comments coming. We will try to cover other aspects of the struggle for socialism that aren't in Europe or the United States in the future. I have Duolingo. I'm going to sign up for that so I can speak other languages by next week. And thanks for watching. I'm going to put our intro, run that as our outro.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,